In a locked records room in 1983 at the old Colorado State Hospital, a sealed manila envelope was found at the back of an unlabeled cabinet. The paper was brittle, the glue seam unbroken, the ink on its cover faded to the color of bone. Inside were 12 index cards, each marked with a name, a date of birth, and a single notation. Subject: observation continues. 6 of the cards bore additional notations in red pencil. 6 did not. There was no accompanying report. No explanation for the split. Only the quiet suggestion that someone, decades earlier, had drawn a line between the living and the soon-to-be lost. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, but the dates told their own story. From 1945 to 1968, 12 children, all born to the same address, all catalogued in a hand that was careful not to betray urgency. On the reverse side of each card were 2 words, sometimes the same, sometimes different, phrases that read like fragments from another language. Compliance partial. Observation escalates. Intervention deferred. None of them explained what had happened inside the house on Hidden Valley Road. The cards had been filed with case histories of unrelated patients. Whether by error or design, their presence in that drawer meant nothing unless someone already knew what to look for. Most did not. And so they were left untouched, the red marks fading, the paper growing brittle, until someone opened the envelope. Not for the first time, but perhaps for the last. Before we go further, I want to ask you, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Share your location and the hour in the comments below. And while you are here with us, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Gothic Ledger so these stories, sealed, misfiled, and almost forgotten, can be told again. Because what you are about to hear is not a work of speculation, it is a record, a reconstruction drawn from medical logs, police reports, family testimony, and the faint handwriting left on 12 pieces of cardstock. 6 of those names will lead us into hospital wards and locked bedrooms. 6 will lead us into quieter rooms where fear took the shape of silence. Together, they form a story that has been studied by scientists, dissected by psychiatrists, and mourned by those who lived it. And yet, after decades of observation, it remains unresolved. Half a family marked in red, half left unmarked, all bound to the same house where the illness did not visit. It lived. The house was built new, split-level, pale brick, with a view toward the Air Force Academy in the distance. It sat just outside the bounds of Colorado Springs proper, nestled in a neighborhood where sidewalks gleamed and lawns stayed cut. The home of Donald and Mimi Galvin, as recorded in parish directories and local civic newsletters, was the picture of stability. A Catholic family devout and multiplying well within the bounds of expectation. In time they would have 12 children, 10 boys and at last 2 girls. To the outside world it was a domestic achievement. Donald Galvin, a career military man, had served in the brutal final stages of the Pacific Campaign. Though there was no diagnostic language for it then, his repeated hospitalizations for attacks of nerves suggest a post-traumatic condition akin to what is now identified as PTSD. His return from war was marked by brooding silence, emotional constraint, and increasing remoteness. Nonetheless, he committed to military life, transferring into the newly established U.S. Air Force and teaching at the academy. He did not drink. He did not rage, but he withdrew, slowly and completely. Mimi Galvin, once ambitious for life in the cultural enclaves of New York, had rerouted her aspirations inward. She turned discipline into ritual, order into meaning. Her devotion to Catholic family ideals was unswerving. There were no shortcuts in raising 12 children. Each child, Donald Jr. James, John, Brian, Michael, Richard, Joseph, Mark, Matthew, Peter, Margaret and Mary, was brought into the world with the same hope, that excellence could be shaped through structure. She ironed napkins. She kept the floors immaculate. The children were dressed sharply and presented without flaw for Sunday Mass, their hair parted, their shoes polished. Their mother, too, rarely appeared in public, anything less than composed. Yet the young, seems, even early, bore strain. By 1963, when the family moved into their newly built home, the Galvins had begun to draw quiet attention, not for dysfunction, but for scale. A dozen children was uncommon even by Catholic standards, and there were peculiarities. The boys, especially in their adolescent years, grew wild. Bruises were common. Neighbors noted the sounds, thuds, yells, glass cracking, followed by silence. There was no corporal punishment, but there was boxing. Rather than curbing their aggression, Donald Sr. issued gloves. He called them by number, not name. 4, get in line. 6, clean that up. The house ran not by affection but by function. Falconry became the family's strange shared pastime, domesticating wild birds, tethering nature through force and patience. Photos from the era show the older boys with gloves and birds of prey perched on their arms. Mimi likely saw it as discipline. Others saw something more unsettling, control masked as hobby, flight restrained. The girls, arriving last, entered a house already rigid with masculine tension. Margaret and Mary, who would later change her name to Lindsay, grew up learning to watch carefully, to avoid the sparks that could ignite. There were no obvious outbursts in public, but broken windows were replaced quickly. Fights, even bloody ones, were resolved without police reports. The children were taught silence. Appearances were sacred. Inside, the emotional ecology of the Galvin household was barren. Praise was scarce. Personal conversation rarer still. Individual suffering was dismissed, misread as disobedience. Donald Sr. was often away. Mimi, alone, grew less responsive as the years advanced. Her answer to chaos was deeper order. From a clinical standpoint, it is often not the presence of violence, but the absence of attention that incubates pathology. By the late 1960s, the Galvin home contained children suffering from early signs of psychosis, delusion, and antisocial behavior. But no diagnosis had been sought. They were simply acting out. What mattered most was that no one outside the walls could see. There was no poverty, no addiction, no documented abuse. On paper, the Galvin family was exemplary. 12 children, a stable marriage, military honor, clean clothes, falconry, church. Yet case notes from later years return to one recurring phrase spoken by neighbors, teachers, and eventually doctors. Something was wrong in that house. It would take decades to understand what. In truth, the Galvin residence was not a home in any traditional sense. It was a quiet battleground. Order against instability, discipline against something far older, far more embedded. Madness did not erupt, it seeped. Behind the polite dinners and Sunday rituals, a slow fracture was already spreading across the family's genetic core. But in 1951, all was still intact. For now, Donald Galvin Jr., the firstborn, presented in early childhood as cognitively intact, physically robust, and socially well adapted. School records describe him as disciplined and engaged. Teachers noted his leadership among peers, while athletic coaches at both the middle and high school levels referred to his rare combination of strength and precision. He played football and excelled in wrestling, two sanctioned outlets for physical intensity that masked emerging dysregulation. By the age of 17, he was dating the daughter of a high-ranking general at the Air Force Academy. To observers, Don Jr. was the proof of his parents' efforts, the prototype of a successful, well-bred American son. Initial aberrations were subtle: withdrawn stares at family dinners, long silences following seemingly minor provocations. But in clinical hindsight, these were early signs of effective flattening and emerging disconnection. During this period, he also began expressing vague discomfort around others, a perceived inability to connect. He did not report this to his parents, nor did they inquire. Within the household, conflict was normalized. Wrestling and physical altercations were treated as routine masculine behavior. While attending Colorado State University, Don Jr.'s behavior became more difficult to rationalize. The first recorded incident occurred at a university bonfire event, where he suddenly and without provocation leapt directly into the flames. He emerged with minor burns and no explanation. He laughed, then fell silent. No formal intervention was initiated. Months later, he was reported to have methodically strangled a cat, his roommate discovering the remains in a box beneath the dormitory sink. When questioned, Don Jr. claimed the act meant nothing, but refused to elaborate. The incident was not reported to animal control or mental health authorities. He remained enrolled. Academic performance declined moderately, though he remained eligible. Professors noted absences and detached behavior. University health services were consulted once. Don Jr. himself initiated the visit, complaining of barriers between himself and other people. No psychiatric referral was made. The student was returned to class. At home, during school breaks, his behavior deteriorated further. One winter, he began removing all the furniture from the family's living room, placing each item methodically in the backyard, without comment or request. Later, he poured salt into the aquarium, killing the fish. These incidents were dismissed as stress responses by his parents, who believed his marriage was faltering. Following graduation, Don Jr. separated from his wife and returned to live at the Galvin home. There, his behavior became increasingly erratic. In one episode, he stood silently at the kitchen sink and shattered 10 ceramic dishes one by one, pausing between each. On another occasion, he sat on the garage floor for hours, repeating a phrase that no one could identify. Still, no diagnosis was pursued. The first major psychiatric emergency occurred when Don Jr. attempted to murder his wife by forcing her to inhale cyanide fumes. This act resulted in his arrest, hospitalization, and finally, a formal psychiatric evaluation. At what was then known as the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The diagnosis, long overdue, brought no relief to the family. It confirmed what Mimi had refused to say aloud and what Donald Sr. would never publicly acknowledge. By the time of his diagnosis, Don Jr.'s younger siblings numbered 9. Several of them had already witnessed his outbursts, had been bruised by his fists or silenced by his stares, yet none had language for what they were seeing. The phrase mental illness was still avoided in the household, replaced by euphemisms. Don's going through something. He just needs time. He's high-strung. The institutions around him, family, university, medical, failed in sequence. Each had glimpsed the fracture, but not the fault line. Each elected to wait. The signs had been visible: the bonfire, the cat, the broken dishes, the suffocating silence, but no one intervened until it was nearly fatal. Donald Jr. was the first to fall. The house would never recover. The Galvin case, when presented in cross-sectional review, offers a near-unique concentration of genetically linked psychotic disorder onset within a single sibling cohort. After Donald Jr.'s diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, 5 of his brothers, James, Brian, Matthew, Peter, and Joseph, each demonstrated individual manifestations of the same core affliction. Yet, within this shared diagnosis, the symptomatic variation was profound. Initial records portrayed James as functioning. He married early, had a child, and for a time appeared capable of maintaining both household and employment. But deterioration soon followed. James began reporting voices, disembodied warnings, whispering observers. He turned to alcohol, and his behavior toward his wife, Kathy, grew violent. She reported multiple assaults, including a sustained episode in which he accused her of conspiring against him. Family recollections, later corroborated by statements from his sisters, revealed a more insidious pattern. James molested his younger siblings during periods of escalating psychosis. His decline mirrored Don Jr.'s in many ways: social withdrawal, unpredictable aggression, but with sexual predation as a persistent, repressed feature. No charges were filed. The family never reported it. Brian had no formal psychiatric diagnosis at time of death, but treatment records confirm he had been prescribed antipsychotic medication. Socially, he appeared high-functioning for a time, even relocating to California and entering a romantic relationship with a woman named Noni. This period ended abruptly. 1 month after Noni ended the relationship, both she and Brian were found deceased, her body riddled by a .22 caliber gunshot wound, his by a self-inflicted shot to the head. Police classified it as a murder-suicide. Afterward, family members disclosed that Brian, like James, had sexually abused his sisters during childhood. The revelation was buried alongside the official records. There would be no legal process, only the memory. Matthew's pathology emerged after a violent head trauma, beaten severely by his brother Joseph during a psychotic episode, resulting in neurosurgical intervention. Post-recovery, Matthew displayed signs of severe cognitive disturbance. He began referring to himself as Paul McCartney and insisted he had written songs he could not recall performing. Once, while visiting a family friend to showcase a ceramic vase he had made, Matthew abruptly disrobed and smashed the object against a wall. His case, though less violent than his brother's, was marked by a surreal, constant disconnection from identity. Delusion consumed not only his thoughts, but his selfhood. Peter's break came young. At age 14, he began wetting himself uncontrollably, claiming, "The devil lived beneath the house." Teachers noted his brilliance in mathematics and discipline in ice hockey, but these were rapidly eclipsed by persistent delusions. He received as many as 8 antipsychotic medications without notable improvement. Ultimately, a court-ordered ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, was administered. The seizures reduced agitation, but Peter remained heavily sedated and withdrawn in most subsequent records. His trajectory is one of terror internalized, voices and presences, never seen, always near. He died in 2023, quietly, in sleep. Joseph's descent was marked by uncommon clarity. He retained, throughout most of his illness, the ability to distinguish hallucination from reality, a torment rather than a relief. He experienced intense visions, including conversations with a Chinese emperor in the clouds, and claimed past lives in foreign nations. Voices drove him to send threatening emails to his employer, resulting in job loss. Yet Joseph remained kind, even affectionate. He mailed birthday cards. He expressed regret. He pleaded for the visions to stop. He told his mother that he had been sexually abused by a Catholic priest, a family friend, long trusted. His was a slow implosion, rendered tragic by awareness. In clinical terms, the Galvin brothers exhibit a spectrum of schizophrenia typologies: paranoid, disorganized, delusional, and treatment-resistant. Their timelines do not align perfectly. Some presented in adolescence, others in early adulthood. Some became violent, others only inwardly fractured. What unites them is not behavior, but blood. Their family home, a standard split-level structure, housed 6 concurrent psychoses under one roof. Each case fed and reflected the others. There were no private symptoms, no isolated breaks. Each manifestation had a shadow, a mirror, a predecessor. This was not one illness, but a chorus. In retrospect, the diagnostic failure lies not in any single institution, but in a societal refusal to imagine that so much madness could reside in one address. The Galvin family became a case study in heredity, but only after it had become a tragedy. Their madness was not inherited so much as revealed. One by one, the Galvin household was not designed for daughters. By the time Margaret and Mary, who would later discard the name and call herself Lindsay, were born, the space was already saturated with unrest. Their 10 older brothers occupied nearly every square foot of physical and emotional space. 6 of those brothers, as would later be confirmed, were in various stages of severe psychiatric illness, but no one had yet named it. The girls were not raised, they were absorbed into a structure too brittle to bear scrutiny, too disciplined to show rupture. They were not touched, not harmed in the conventional sense by their parents. Instead, they were abandoned inside an ordered chaos that functioned only as long as no one acknowledged the damage. When violence erupted, and it did often, it was not mediated. The protocol was internal. The youngest, always the smallest, would retreat into the master bedroom, locking the door from the inside, crouching in corners, praying the locks would hold. There were no explanations, no comfort, just silence until the police arrived. This was not once. It was recurrent. Institutional language classifies this as repeated exposure to acute familial dysregulation, a known risk factor in the development of post-traumatic stress, dissociative behaviors, and developmental arrest. Margaret arrived into the family as an answer to Mimi's long-standing wish for a daughter. She was dressed carefully, taught to set tables precisely, and instructed in the discipline of containment. Emotion was discouraged. Achievement, however minor, was expected. But behind closed doors, Margaret suffered a different fate. As disclosed years later by both her and her sister, Margaret was molested, first by Brian, later by James, 2 of the brothers already marked by signs of schizophrenia and deepening delusion. There were no reports, no interventions. When this was revealed, in adulthood Mimi's response was muted. She did not deny it, she did not act. Instead, she referred to the assaults as symptoms of her son's illness, a reframing that reduced her daughter's suffering to collateral consequence. Margaret did not run. She remained close, in body if not in trust. She internalized the family order and functioned within it. Later psychological profiles describe her as hyper-adaptive. She knew how to survive in a closed system. Lindsay, the final child, was not offered the same illusions. She witnessed the house in full descent. Her earliest memories include salt poured into aquariums, furniture moved outdoors in silence, and her eldest brother, naked, expressionless, blocking doorways with a presence no one explained. She too was sexually abused. The exact timeline remains clinically sensitive, but the abuse coincided with periods when she was left in the care of James during family crises. She reported feeling watched, touched, and then told it was nothing, that her brother was just confused. Lindsay did not adapt. She observed. She learned that the only safety was distance. When the opportunity came, she seized it. A scholarship to a boarding school away from Colorado Springs, away from the sound of brothers' fists against walls. She left at 14. In later psychiatric debriefings, she confessed to a complex reaction: relief for escape, guilt for abandoning Margaret, and fury at the mother who had refused to see. Her coping became distance, minimal contact, emotional barricades, and later, therapy. Mimi, when confronted, revealed her own trauma. She had been sexually abused by her stepfather, a fact shared only when her daughters were grown. But her disclosure came not with empathy, but explanation. She had learned, she said, to endure, and so she expected her daughters to do the same. Donald Sr. remained distant, absent in both form and presence. He did not speak to the girls about what happened. He did not ask. In official records and family narratives alike, he remains a void. Margaret and Lindsay present a textbook case of non-primary psychiatric victims, subjects whose trauma is invisible to diagnostic systems focused only on psychosis, yet their symptoms are traceable: chronic anxiety, difficulty forming attachments, high-functioning dissociation. Their childhood was not a series of memories. It was a strategy, a daily negotiation between risk and silence. They were not daughters, they were witnesses, too young to name what they saw, too abandoned to ask anyone else to. For them there was no treatment, no diagnosis, only the knowledge that if they waited long enough, the door would open, or it wouldn't, and the silence would begin again. In such homes, escape is not betrayal, it is therapy. This record is compiled in the manner of an internal clergy abuse investigation, wherein the presence of faith-based authority intersects with family dysfunction to create conditions for persistent, concealed harm. The Galvin case presents multiple, cross-generational incidents of sexual abuse perpetrated both within the nuclear family and by individuals entrusted with pastoral and moral authority. The narrative of illness, schizophrenia, as an overwhelming family burden provided both a camouflage and a ready-made explanation for behavior that under other circumstances might have provoked immediate intervention. Within this constructed silence, abuse flourished. Testimonies gathered from Margaret and Lindsay confirm repeated molestation at the hands of James Galvin, occurring during his active psychotic episodes. At the time, James was already exhibiting signs of schizoaffective disorder, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, intermittent violence. The sisters' accounts describe assaults occurring in spaces intended for safety: the girls' bedroom, the locked master bedroom they were told to retreat to during violent episodes, even the back seat of the family car during errands. Brian Galvin's abuse predates James's, targeting the sisters when they were still in early childhood. Unlike James, whose psychosis was overt, Brian was, for a time, outwardly functional, allowing his predation to escape suspicion. The assaults were not isolated events, but part of a pattern, repeated and unchallenged. Neither brother faced criminal investigation. Both were shielded under the explanation of illness, a reframing that excused the behavior as symptomatic rather than criminal. Joseph Galvin, in later adulthood, disclosed that he had been sexually abused by a Catholic priest who had long been a friend to the family. This individual was often entrusted with care of the Galvin children. Parental oversight was absent, particularly during Mimi's hospital visits or Donald Sr.'s extended military assignments. Joseph's account is consistent with documented clerical grooming behaviors: initial kindness, special attention, private instruction under the guise of religious guidance. The abuse was not disclosed at the time. Joseph feared disbelief or reprisal. By the time he revealed it to his mother, the priest was no longer in active parish service, and the disclosure did not result in formal complaint to the diocese. In a private exchange years later, prompted by confrontation from her daughters about their own abuse, Mimi revealed that she too had been molested as a child by her stepfather. She framed this not as a confession, but as explanation, implying that endurance, not intervention, was the model she had learned. Her disclosure is significant in institutional terms. It establishes a three-generation chain of sexual abuse, each link sustained by silence and authority. In this schema, suffering is normalized, protective structures are absent, and perpetrators are insulated by roles, brother, priest, patriarch, that deter scrutiny. The most troubling element is not the individual acts of abuse, but the collusion, implicit and explicit, of the systems meant to safeguard the vulnerable. Within the Galvin home, illness became a catch-all absolution. Within the church, clerical trust was treated as evidence of moral integrity, rendering suspicion inappropriate. Faith was invoked to forgive. Family loyalty was invoked to forget. And in the end, the silence that bound them was not born of ignorance, but of design. In the Galvin household, trauma was not an interruption of order. It was part of it. By the close of the 1970s, the Galvin home had shifted from a site of family habitation to an unlicensed involuntary care facility. Its layout, split-level open plan, was not suited for containment, yet it was adapted to meet the demands of chronic psychiatric disturbance. In 1978, records indicate that 3 of the Galvin sons were in separate wards of the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo. The remaining diagnosed brothers cycled between short-term hospitalization and home, where Mimi assumed the role of primary custodian. Medication regimens, often inconsistent and variably effective, included stelazine, thorazine, haldol, and, in more resistant cases, lithium carbonate. Compliance was monitored only informally. Dosages were sometimes adjusted without consultation, either to minimize sedation before family events or to subdue acute agitation. Reports compiled from police calls and family accounts note recurring episodes of environmental destruction, furniture overturned without warning, frequently broken beyond repair, crockery shattered in kitchens and dining areas, glass embedded in carpet, windows smashed with bare hands, leading to lacerations requiring sutures, restraint of subjects by multiple family members until physical exhaustion reduced the risk of injury. Screaming, nonverbal, prolonged was a common auditory feature. Such episodes could last minutes or hours. Hallucination-driven aggression was often indiscriminate, directed towards siblings, objects, or self. Mimi's role was both caretaker and custodian of appearances. Bloodstains on walls were scrubbed before neighbors could notice. Upholstery was patched, replaced, or turned toward the wall to conceal damage. Broken doors were rehung within days. To maintain function, Lindsay, then the youngest in residence, was enlisted to assist, delivering meals to sedated brothers, clearing debris after outbursts, managing locked doors when police were en route. Her tasks blurred the line between sibling and orderly. Police arrivals became procedural. Officers knew the address. They entered without sirens, aware that escalation could provoke further disturbance. Restraint was applied only as necessary for transport. One documented episode, retained in family recollection, occurred during Thanksgiving dinner. The table was set to Mimi's standard, pressed linens, polished silver, the turkey positioned precisely at center. The event was intended as a gesture of normalcy, a reminder to all present of the family they once appeared to be. Without provocation, Donald Jr. rose, seized the end of the dining table, and flipped it toward James. Plates shattered, cutlery skittered across the floor, food splattered against the walls. The act ended the gathering immediately. No one ate, no one spoke. Within an hour, the table had been righted, shards swept, stains blotted. By the next morning, the dining room appeared untouched. By all functional measures, the Galvin home met criteria for a closed psychiatric unit. Multiple diagnosed residents with severe and persistent mental illness. Regular administration of antipsychotic medication under informal supervision. Acute episodes requiring external intervention. Structural adaptation for containment, locked doors, cleared rooms, restricted areas. The difference lay only in its invisibility. There was no charting, no trained staff, no oversight committee, only a mother preserving the surface and a youngest daughter learning to move through her own home as though it were a corridor of locked wards. Externally, the house remained a model suburban residence, lawns trimmed, shutters intact. Internally, it had become an environment of perpetual damage control. Neighbors did not inquire. If they did, they were met with explanations concise enough to deflect suspicion. The structure had been built in optimism, sold as stability, and filled with promise. By the late 1970s, it was neither home nor haven. It was a place where psychosis was managed, not cured, where containment replaced treatment and survival replaced living. Among the 12 Galvin children, 4 sons, John, Mark, Michael, and Richard, remained untouched by a formal diagnosis of schizophrenia. In clinical classification, they are non-affected carriers within a high-incidence genetic pool. In practical reality, they are men who lived under the constant shadow of an illness they did not manifest, yet could never fully escape. In interviews and secondary reports, all 4 express some degree of what psychiatric literature terms survivor's guilt, a persistent questioning of why the illness consumed their brothers, but not themselves. In the Galvin case, guilt was compounded by fear. The onset of schizophrenia often occurs in early adulthood. For each, their 20s and 30s were marked by hypervigilance, tracking every lapse in concentration, every flicker of mood, for signs of the same collapse. John's approach to survival was geographic removal. Observing the progression of psychosis in his older and younger brothers, he interpreted each outburst as a preview of his own future. Rather than risk proximity, he relocated to Idaho with his wife, taking a teaching position in music. He maintained minimal contact with the family, citing logistical barriers, but privately acknowledged a deeper motive, the belief that distance could protect him not only from the illness, but from the family's gravitational pull toward crisis. His records indicate no psychiatric intervention, but his avoidance was absolute. Michael came closest to diagnosis without crossing the threshold. Twice admitted to psychiatric wards for observation in his teens, he was prescribed stelazine for a period and monitored for emerging psychosis. He rejected the label of mentally ill and discontinued medication against medical advice. Instead, he turned to self-regulation through meditation and mindfulness practices, crediting them with stabilizing his mental state. While his trajectory suggests he may have been experiencing prodromal symptoms, mild perceptual disturbances, transient paranoia, these did not progress into chronic illness. His case presents a rare instance of self-directed preventative adaptation in a high-risk environment. Richard responded with withdrawal of a different kind into the abstracted, insulated world of finance. He became a mining investor in Denver, a profession that allowed him to control variables and avoid unpredictable interpersonal dynamics. He rarely engaged with the family outside obligatory events. While he did not exhibit overt psychiatric symptoms, colleagues noted his rigidity in routine and discomfort with unstructured situations, traits that may reflect adaptive responses to a chaotic, formative environment. Mark was the only member of the family's elite hockey lineup to remain free of diagnosis, a fact that he admitted caused him the most internal disruption. He had trained and competed alongside brothers whose athletic promise was later eroded by illness. He watched teammates, friends, and his own siblings fall into delusion, violence, or institutionalization. Mark lived in a constant state of expectation, waiting for the first unmistakable symptom. He remained healthy, but the psychological cost was high. In later life, he described feeling like a man holding a door shut without knowing what was on the other side. While these 4 brothers avoided the clinical criteria for schizophrenia, their lived experience was defined by it. Survivor's guilt kept them tethered to the family's narrative. Hypervigilance shaped their relationships, careers, and sense of self. In genetic research, unaffected is a neutral descriptor, a way to mark those spared from the illness under study. But in lived terms, it is misleading. These men did not inherit the psychosis, they inherited the fear of it, an unremitting suspicion that it could still arrive unannounced years after the danger was presumed past. For the Galvin Four, survival was not liberation. It was a sentence of constant watchfulness. They walked away without the illness, but never without the shadow. In the historical record of the Galvin case, Mimi appears first as the archetype of the mid-century American mother, devout, disciplined, committed to the presentation of domestic perfection. Her home was ordered to a fault, floors polished, curtains pressed, napkins ironed to a precise fold. Meal settings were symmetrical, photographs curated, children groomed for public display. Behind this symmetry, however, her standards functioned as both structure and shield. Her daughters would later describe her as a drill sergeant, a woman who expected excellence and tolerated little deviation. The discipline extended beyond the ordinary boundaries of household management. A poorly made bed could provoke a lecture. A scuffed shoe was cause for repolishing before church. In the context of a home destabilized by mental illness, this precision became a coping mechanism, a way to impose order on an environment increasingly beyond control. Mimi maintained the family's image with equal vigilance. Neighbors saw only the disciplined exterior. Friends from the parish knew her as gracious and committed. There was no public acknowledgement of the chaos inside. Police calls were explained away. Hospital visits were reframed as checkups. The language of illness was avoided. She rarely confided in anyone, not even close friends, about the severity of her children's psychiatric conditions. In the mid-20th century, psychiatric discourse included the concept of the schizophrenogenic mother, a theory advanced by figures such as Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, asserting that cold, over-controlling maternal behavior could cause schizophrenia in children. The theory has since been discredited, but Mimi's visible traits, emotional reserve, perfectionism, and unyielding standards, made her an easy target for such mischaracterization. In interviews, some clinicians hinted she fit the profile. The truth is more complex. While she did not cause her son's illness, her manner and strategies for concealment may have amplified their isolation and delayed intervention. Mimi resisted the long-term institutionalization of her sons, even when state hospitals were recommended. Her reasoning was twofold: fear of public stigma and belief that she could manage them at home. Breakdowns were hidden, doors locked, curtains drawn, explanations rehearsed. In her mind, handing a child over to an institution was a failure of motherhood, one she would not commit. This resistance placed immense strain on the family's youngest members, who bore witness to psychosis without the buffer of professional care. In later years, Mimi disclosed to her daughters that she had been sexually abused as a child by her stepfather. The revelation came not as a plea for sympathy, but as an explanation for her endurance. She had survived without intervention, therefore she believed survival, without complaint, was possible for anyone. Her own history, unaddressed and untreated, may have reinforced her tolerance for dysfunction and her minimization of her children's trauma. In clinical terms, Mimi's behavior reflects an adaptive control strategy in a high-stress, multimorbidity environment, maintaining rigid external order to compensate for internal disorder. Yet her methods, silence, concealment, minimization, also perpetuated harm, allowing psychiatric decline and abuse to persist unseen. The Galvin household under her management functioned like an elaborate structure of balance, appearances supported by discipline, discipline supported by secrecy. Every polished surface, every folded napkin, every immaculate Sunday presentation was another card in a fragile arrangement. She lived, knowing that one misstep, a neighbor's suspicion, a public outburst, an official inquiry, could bring it all down. And when it did, it would not just collapse her home. It would collapse the image she had spent a lifetime constructing. The first samples arrived decades before the technology to fully interrogate them existed. In the early 1980s, blood was drawn from members of the Galvin family, both those diagnosed with schizophrenia and those who, by all outward measures, were healthy. The collection was part of a broader psychiatric genetics initiative, a search for patterns in the DNA of families with unusually high incidence of severe mental illness. At the time, the analytical tools were limited. Chromosomal karyotyping, rudimentary linkage analysis, and early molecular assays yielded no definitive findings. The samples were stored, catalogued under code numbers rather than names, and sent into the slow orbit of scientific preservation, frozen in freezers that would hum quietly for decades. In 2016, the Galvin samples were pulled into a new study involving only 9 families worldwide. The criteria were precise: at least 3 siblings with schizophrenia and at least 3 without. The Galvins exceeded the threshold: 6 affected, 6 unaffected, offering a genetic contrast rarely available in psychiatric research. This time, whole genome sequencing and advanced bioinformatics were applied. Across millions of genetic data points, one anomaly recurred: a mutation in the SHANK2 gene, found in every Galvin sibling who had provided blood. SHANK2 encodes a protein involved in the structural scaffolding of synapses, the junctions through which neurons communicate. Disruption of this protein can alter the efficiency and stability of synaptic signaling, with potential downstream effects on cognition, perception, and emotional regulation. The mutation was not novel in the human genome. It had been observed in other contexts: developmental delay, autism spectrum conditions, but here it appeared consistently in a family where schizophrenia dominated the medical history. All 7 brothers who had been diagnosed carried it. The revelation was complicated by a fact that undermined any notion of a direct causal pathway. The 4 brothers who remained free of schizophrenia also carried the SHANK2 mutation. The gene was present in both the healthy and the ill. It was a shared blueprint, not an isolated defect. What differed between the 2 groups was not the DNA sequence, but the expression. How and when the blueprint was activated, if at all. Why did the mutation manifest in some and not others? Theories include environmental triggers, early life stress, viral infection, head trauma, or interactions with other, as yet unidentified, genetic variations, but the truth remains inaccessible. From a research standpoint, the SHANK2 finding was a breakthrough, a pathway, if not a cause. From a clinical standpoint, it offered no immediate remedy. There was no gene to edit, no protein to supplement, no pill to prevent onset. Only the knowledge that risk could be carried in silence for decades, never surfacing or emerging without warning. The Galvin study confirmed that madness could be mapped, at least in part, into the double helix. But the map was incomplete, and the route from mutation to psychosis remained obscure. In the language of genetics, the family carried a risk allele. In the language of history, they carried a prophecy that might or might not come true. The sequence was there, written into their biology before birth, a set of instructions capable of dismantling perception and self. Yet there is, even now, no way to read the trigger, no test to say when or if it will begin. In the Galvin family, nature left its signature, but it gave no warning and no mercy. A blueprint for madness without a map for prevention. By the early 21st century, the arc of the Galvin case had settled into a grim equilibrium. The early years of onset and rapid decline were over. What remained was the residue. Lives bracketed by diagnosis, others defined by avoidance, all framed by the permanence of record. James Galvin, second born, died in 2001 at the age of 55. The coroner's report listed heart failure, likely induced by the cumulative cardiotoxic effects of long-term antipsychotic medication. His death was quiet, almost unremarked beyond the family. For decades, his presence had been one of volatility. In absence, he was reduced to a file number and a cause of death. Peter, once the promising hockey player undone by paranoid visions of the devil beneath the house, died in his sleep in 2023. No violent episode preceded it, no crisis call brought paramedics to the door. He simply ceased, another long-resident patient who would not be returning home. Mimi Galvin, the matriarch, died in 2017. She left behind no confession, no re-evaluation of the life she had presided over. Donald Sr., whose withdrawal had become his defining role, had preceded her in 2003. They were buried without public acknowledgement of the unique medical and psychological legacy that followed their name. Don Jr. and Matthew remain institutionalized in Colorado Springs. They exist now as enduring cases, men long past the point of active rehabilitation, their conditions managed rather than treated. Their presence is a reminder of an illness that began before most of their siblings were born and has never truly left the family's orbit. Lindsay, the youngest, returned in her mother's final years to help navigate the bureaucratic landscape of care, state hospital paperwork, benefits, burial arrangements. She acted as both caretaker and archivist, ensuring that what was left of the family's records could be managed, if not deemed. The story has been told, first in Hidden Valley Road, inside the mind of an American family, then in an HBO documentary, 6 Schizophrenic Brothers. It has been analyzed by geneticists, psychiatrists, criminologists. It has been filed in academic journals, debated at conferences, and dissected in the media. Yet, like many case studies, the essential truth remains out of reach. No chart captures the weight of a locked bedroom door. No genetic sequence encodes the fear of a child listening for the sound of breaking glass. No published paper fully explains why some escaped the illness while others were consumed. The Galvin family is closed in file, but open in implication, a reminder that schizophrenia did not simply visit their home, it lived there, as permanent a resident as any of its occupants. Hidden Valley Road remains an address, and a warning. The records are closed now. The house on Hidden Valley Road has changed owners more than once, its rooms repainted, its floors replaced. But the walls remember. They have carried the weight of 12 names, 6 marked in red, 6 spared but never free. James is gone, his heart stopped by the same medication meant to quiet his mind. Peter died in sleep, decades after the first visions drove him to the edge. Don Jr. and Matthew remain in institutional care, their files still updated, though the handwriting has changed. Mimi and Donald Sr. lie together in the cemetery outside Colorado Springs, their headstones as silent as they were in life. The surviving brothers live scattered lives, some still in the shadow of expectation, others avoiding the past entirely. Lindsay, the youngest, returned in the final years, not to reconcile, but to manage what remained. The story has been bound into a book, projected on a screen, examined under the sterile light of genetic research. Yet no study, no sequence of DNA, no stack of case files has explained the single question that lingers: why them and not others? The SHANK2 mutation offers a pathway, but not a verdict. It is a map drawn without a destination. The Galvin family has been measured, dissected, and archived. They have been mourned in pieces, but they have never been understood. And so, Hidden Valley Road remains more than an address. It is a warning of what can live in the walls, unseen, until it consumes the house entire. If you have stayed with us through this history, I invite you to tell us, where are you watching from and what time is it there now? Share it in the comments. And if you have not yet, subscribe to Gothic Ledger and like this video so these histories, quiet, cold, and almost lost, can find their way to you. Tomorrow, another file will open, another sealed envelope, another set of names, another story buried beneath the weight of official silence. Until then, remember, some records were never meant to be found.